Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'd like to talk about UFO landing cases. Sightings are certainly very interesting, but far more interesting and compelling, I think, are cases in which the objects actually land. This is usually involving very close-up encounters, so the chances of misperception are virtually zero. And also it doesn't involve a lot of the controversies that surround on-board experiences. And by that I mean missing time and the use of regressive hypnosis. So today's episode I call 7 UFO landing cases. I'm going to do various readings from my books that I've published on UFOs over various states. And I chose cases that I think are unique or provide a lot of information or credibility, or are unusual in some way and provide some insights into the UFO phenomena. So let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about, I call UFO landing at Ellie, Nevada. On June 25, 1964, rancher George W. Rogers and his brother Bert were driving from their home in Spring Valley to the town of Ellie, Nevada. And at some point between the two towns, they noticed a strange-looking object ahead of them. It was hovering about 4 feet high alongside the road. And at first, they could only see the top half of the object, as the bottom half was obscured by the brush. And they speculated that maybe a Jeep had fallen off the road. But as the two men drew closer to the object, it suddenly rose up and then descended, landing right in the center of the road. They described the object as having a bulged, curved, pyramid-shaped top that tapered down to a 2-foot-long, slender pedestal, which the object apparently used as a kind of landing gear. This may have actually been a beam of light. It's hard to say, but to them it looked like it was composed of some kind of shiny metal or plastic. And this entire object spun rapidly, but remained in the same location. They said there was a strange red insignia on one side of the object, but the witnesses were unable to read it because of the object's spinning motions. So this has some similarities to the famous Lani Zamora Socorro, New Mexico landing. At any rate, George Rogers jumped out of the car and ran up to touch the object. However, as soon as he got close, he made a loud humming noise and zoomed 10 feet up into the air, landing back down 40 feet ahead on the highway. And he ran forward again and tried to approach the object with the same result. This object lifted up again and moved farther away. And George Rogers did the same thing another 3 times. And on each occasion, this object increased in noise and hopped further ahead on the highway. As George later told UFO researchers, "It occurred to me that I was fooling around with something that I didn't know anything about. Bert was yelling for me to get away from that thing. I decided that was pretty good advice, so I went back and got into the car." It was at that point that the object rose slowly and then zoomed away to the east over a ridge and off into the distance. This case was researched by Frank Edwards, the UFO researcher, and it was also published in the Ellie Record newspaper on July 1st of that year. So it's a very interesting case where a UFO lands in the middle of the road. The second case I'd like to talk about, I call the UFO House. And this took place in Sierra Vista, Arizona. It's a very unusual case. I love this case because it's so unusual. It was around 9:45 p.m. one December evening in 2012 when a lady and her husband, who are anonymous, stepped outside of their home in Sierra Vista, Arizona before bedtime to look at the stars. And instead, their attention was drawn to a field nearby their house. And as one of the witnesses says, and I quote, "We were only out there about a minute before we noticed what appeared to us to be a single-unit mobile home or rectangular-shaped house in the field across the street. This field is totally fenced in, and there has been nothing there for several years. So the couple was completely mystified because they hadn't heard or seen anything, and it was as if this house, this strange-looking house, had just magically shown up. As one of the witnesses says, "There appeared to be a door with a window on each side. Lights were on, but the house or object appeared to be empty. We just sat there discussing how odd it was that we never saw it being moved in, or how quickly electricity seemed to be hooked up, but shook it off and went to bed." So the next morning, the couple woke up and got an incredible shock. This house was gone. In fact, there was no evidence that it had ever been there. The field was still totally fenced in. And as the witness says, "We don't know for sure what it was, but it was very, very odd. To this day, every time we drive by, we always look at the fencing to see how someone could have pulled in a trailer. And there is no way." So it was 2 years after the incident, they were still mystified, that the couple decided to report their case to MUFON. And this is MUFON case number 60151. They believe it could have been a UFO. The third case I'd like to talk about also took place in Arizona, and I call this UFO Landing at Lukachukai. It's a very interesting and unusual case, which I think you'll find quite compelling. This next case was also reported to MUFON. It's MUFON case number 930618, and it was researched by MUFON field investigator Richard D. Seafried. This occurred in mid-August of 1982 in the early morning hours at around 1:45 a.m. The main witness, Chris, that's a pseudonym, was traveling with his father and his father's friends to the Lukachukai rodeo. This is about 10 miles north of town when they saw a star-like object moving through the sky, and without warning, the object approached them. It came within 100 feet when it suddenly sparkled and disappeared, leaving only a hazy cloud. And wondering if they had seen a meteor or something else unexplained, they drove another 5 miles when they came upon a mysterious glowing light coming from inside a canyon that dropped off to the left of the road. So they decided to investigate. They drove to the top of a hill and pulled over to take a look, and despite standing on top of the truck, the source of the light was just out of sight. Until Chris's father put him on top of his shoulders. Only then did Chris see an actual object. It appeared to be landed. He couldn't be sure, but he was intrigued. He wanted to hike down the canyon, but his father was nervous about hiking at night in such a rough area, and meanwhile their friend had become frightened and retreated to the truck. So they watched the glow for only a few minutes and then drove away. But this is not the end of the story. There's a very interesting endnote. Once they reached the town, they pulled into a convenience store, and Chris's father told the clerk, "You won't believe what I just saw." The clerk listened and then provided some very interesting information. He told them that an entire family had stopped by his store earlier that evening and were, quote, "very frightened." They told the clerk that a strange object had landed on their property, and it scared them so bad that they fled their home and went to the convenience store to call the authorities. So it seems pretty likely that that was the same object. The fourth case I'd like to talk about I chose for a couple of reasons. One is because it took place really just a few miles from where I've lived for many years in the San Fernando Valley in California. And I call this case UFO Landing in the San Fernando Valley, California. It involved not only one landing, but a series of landings involving several witnesses. This series of landings was investigated by prominent Southern California researcher Idabel Epperson, and this involved an amazing series of contacts with tall, human-like ETs. It took place in the summer of 1955, directly in the heart of the San Fernando Valley. It was sometime in mid-June 1955 when Ted Kittredge, a young electrician from Van Nuys, told reporters that he was awakened in the middle of the night by the barking of his dogs. Exiting his home, he was amazed to see a gigantic gold-colored sphere landed in his front yard, and standing next to it were 3 7-foot-tall human-looking figures. He says they were very friendly, they had long, flowing hair, and spoke flawless English, quote, as if they had memorized thousands of conversations and were repeating the words on tape. So Kettridge was very much impressed, and as he says, and I quote, "The 3 men approached me without hesitation and told me not to be frightened. I was really scared. In fact, the whole thing seemed like a dream, only I know it wasn't. Several other people in the valley had seen the same thing, even talked with the men. I just hope I never see it again, that's all." So they left him with a few messages and were gone. And what's really interesting is that there were several other witnesses. In fact, it was only 1 month later, on July 20th, 1955, when 3 separate independent witnesses reported seeing a UFO and its occupants. And this occurred in Panorama City, which is directly adjacent to Van Nuys and appears to be connected to Todd Kettridge's encounter. And according to the report, a huge ball-shaped object landed in a field near the witness's home, and the witnesses observed 3 beings approximately 6 to 8 feet in height with long blonde hair and clothed in tight green suits. And 2 of the witnesses reported that these beings made gestures of friendship. So this is described exactly like Kettridge described what he saw. So it appears that these were, in fact, the same ETs. The next case I'd like to talk about, I call the Old Wise Ones. And this involves a series of encounters, including face-to-face meetings with extraterrestrials, and, of course, landings. And this took place in a very large ranch just west of Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I think you'll find this one very interesting. This case involves a gentleman I call Michael. That's a pseudonym. He grew up on a 3,000-acre ranch about 50 miles west of Colorado Springs. And for as long as he could remember, there was something very strange about the ranch. As Michael says, and I quote, "There was an area on the ranch that you could not go to. Horses would refuse to go into this area, and if I forced the issue, they would go crazy and start bucking. I never could walk into that range of small mountains. If I did, a very strange, overpowering fear would sweep over me until I turned around and crossed that invisible boundary, and instantly it would go away." So over the years, using the horses, Michael soon learned exactly where the border of this area was, and it never changed. He was baffled by this mystery, but soon learned what this area was hiding. It was on Christmas Eve, 1960. Michael was 16 years old. He woke up at 2:30 a.m. to see a strange, dark object descending toward the meadow behind his house. It was so bright it was lighting up the entire valley where the ranch was located. And even though it was 20 degrees below zero with 3 feet of snow outside, Michael couldn't resist taking a closer look. As he says, and I quote, "I stepped outside on the porch in my long johns and gazed up. What I saw I'll never forget. A massive, black, rectangular-shaped object just floated over our meadow. I ran back into the house, jumped into my coats and snow boots, and took off running across the meadow toward the craft." So in a few moments, Michael stood directly under the craft. He estimates it hovered about 300 feet high, and that it was about 1,500 feet long, 500 feet wide, and 300 feet thick. As he says, "What was very strange about this was the entire time I was looking at it, I felt safe and somehow knew that they were mining for minerals." He stood under this object for as long as he could. The object remained totally still, and feeling the cold seeping into his clothes, Michael was forced to retreat inside. So he now wondered at this point if the ETs were somehow connected to the area of the ranch where none of the horses or cows would go. As he says, it was common knowledge about that location. It was a family joke that we always knew where the cattle and the horses weren't. When I was a kid, I would take friends to the borderline and we would run into the area in an attempt to try and tease the aliens. I found out in short order that they were not amused. I began having terrible nightmares. I knew it was them, so I went back to the boundary line and I shouted to them that I was sorry and I wouldn't bother them again. That night, the nightmares ended, and so did my trips to that area. But it wasn't long before Michael had a face-to-face encounter with these apparent aliens. As he says, and again I quote, "You might say I've grown up with the aliens. I've seen them. Some look like us. Others, the old wise ones, are on the average 7 feet tall with elongated skulls and blue translucent bodies. They are trillions of years older than we are and are very gentle and loving. I have had 2 of them appear before me from time to time to check in on me. They watched me grow up as the only child on our huge, very isolated ranch. I could always feel them protecting me when I was alone in the forest. They love us and consider us their children. They have come back now to help us through what is coming. They will soon introduce themselves to the world." As in many other cases of contact, Michael says he has been given warnings of upcoming disasters. As he says, and I quote, "They have showed me what is coming. A global nuclear war that will destroy nearly all of America, Europe, Russia, and China. Michael says that another alien faction is controlling the New World Order. In 1989, he says, he traveled to Venezuela, where he had another encounter with the blue beings, and they told him that there is an underground city beneath the jungles of Venezuela inhabited by a group of aliens who are preparing to help humanity survive the upcoming disasters. They told him the city will be a center of growth and knowledge and that it is safeguarded by a protective energetic dome which will keep it safe during the wars. As he says, Tesla, Marconi, and Fulcanelli were involved, and I have personally met 2 high-ranking Venezuelan officers who interface with the city. The New World Order knows full well about the city, but they are powerless to do anything about it. And Michael says because of this city, Venezuela will be the target of growing aggression from the New World Order. And as he says, and I quote, "If you want a good timeline, watch very carefully what happens between Venezuela and the New World Order." So I find this very interesting because recently Venezuela has been having all kinds of unrest and political problems. So make of that case what you will, but I thought it was very interesting, and Michael reported his case to MUFON. The next case I'd like to talk about I call UFO Landing at Las Cruces, New Mexico. This is a somewhat famous case, though I'm guessing a lot of you haven't heard of it, and I think this is a case that's important enough that everyone should know about it, and that's why I wanted to include it in this episode. One evening in June or July of 1952, Hilda McAfee, who was then in her late 50s, and her elderly mother were driving from Las Cruces to their home in Deming, New Mexico. They were about 23 miles east of Deming on Interstate 10 when they saw a blinding blue light ahead of them in their lane. Hilda slowed down and pulled around and alongside the object, and as they drove by, the women were shocked to see 2 strange-looking figures standing directly underneath a brightly lit object. The figures were 5.5 feet tall, muscular-looking, and wore identical, bulky, pale blue uniforms with helmets, gloves, wide belts, and calf-length boots. They paid no attention to Hilda and her mother as they drove by. One had his back turned to them and appeared to be working on something, while the other stood in a rigid, stiff posture. The woman also saw 3 black, 5-inch thick rods next to the 2 figures. After they passed the object, the woman looked behind them and were amazed to see that the object had extinguished its lights, and they speculated that the lights had been turned on to prevent them from colliding into the object. Following this incident, both women suffered some unusual symptoms, including pains in their chest, arms, and bones. And at first, they kept their encounter a complete secret. And in fact, it was many years later, after the Travis Walton abduction on November 5, 1975, in Snowflake, Arizona, that Hilda McAfee decided to reveal her encounter. Because as it turns out, Hilda was the landlady of Cheney Rogers, who was brother to Mike Rogers, one of the witnesses to the Travis Walton abduction case. And it was this connection that finally prompted her to go public with her own experience. And the last case that I'd like to talk about today, I call UFO Landing in Conklin, New York. This involves a small group of young children, all of who witnessed a landed UFO and an extraterrestrial. It's quite an interesting case, fairly well known within the UFO community. I think you'll find it quite interesting. On the afternoon of July 16, 1964, Miss Travis was in her home in Conklin, New York, while outside her 2 children, Edmund, who was 9 years old, and Randy, who was 7 years old, and their 3 friends, Floyd Moore, Billy Dunlap, and his brother Gary Dunlap, were all playing in a nearby field surrounded by huckleberry bushes. Suddenly, 3 of the boys rushed into Miss Travis's house and requested a large jar of water. And Miss Travis asked why, and they said, quote, "We are taking water over to the spaceman." And seeing that the children were excited and serious, an adult was sent after the other 2 children, and they were found walking home from the field. And when asked, they denied seeing any spaceman. It was clear to the adults, however, that they were lying and concealing the truth about what they saw. So the adults separated the 5 children and questioned each of them about what they had seen. And one by one, they revealed an incredible story. And in fact, when they were cross-examined and threatened with punishment for lying, they broke into tears but refused to retract their claims. The boys said that they were playing in the field when they suddenly noticed a small, human-looking man wearing a black suit and a black helmet. The helmet had a transparent visor over the eyes, antenna-like wires on top, and it was decorated with unidentified symbols or letters. And this little man kept making strange hollow noises, which they said was similar to a kazoo. And at this point, the boys noticed a large object landed in the field. They described it as shiny, like a car bumper, they said, so apparently silvery metallic like chrome. And this spaceman walked up to this silvery object, hopped up on top of it, and at this point, one of the children asked the little man if he needed help, or if he would like some water. And this figure responded by falling backwards from the top of the vehicle, and it was at this point the children ran to go get some water. And when they returned to the spot, this craft and the spaceman were gone. However, in the field, and this was verified by the adults, there was an area of crushed grass and 3 large depressions in the soil where the craft had landed. A very interesting multi-witness case. So those are the 7 cases I wanted to present to you today. And as you can see, they are each unique in their own way, each providing some interesting insights into the nature of the UFO phenomenon. They were taken from my books, UFOs over Arizona, UFOs over California, New York, Colorado, and Nevada. And I think each of these cases are just the tip of the iceberg. The number of UFO landings is far more numerous than people realize. There are hundreds upon hundreds of them. So these 7 cases here are, again, just the tip of the iceberg. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I truly appreciate you watching. So thank you very much for that. And until next time, keep having fun.